My mother-in-law looked me dead in the eye and said, "Peyton's kids eat first. Yours can wait." My daughter was 7 years old. She was sitting at the dining room table with her hands folded in her lap, the way I'd taught her, waiting to be polite. My son was 5. He had his fork already picked up because he was hungry and excited, and he was 5. And my mother-in-law walked past them both, set the serving dish down at the other end of the table, and said what she said like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. I didn't move for a second. I remember the sounds in the room, the TV in the den, my brother-in-law's kids laughing, someone's chair scraping the floor. I looked at my daughter's face. She had heard. She understood enough. She set her fork down and looked at me with those eyes that are too old for a 7-year-old, and I thought, we're done here. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make a scene. I stood up, said, "Come on, let's go get something to eat," took both of my kids by the hand, and we walked out the front door. My husband watched us go. He didn't follow. That was the moment I knew something had to change. Not because of what my mother-in-law said, though that was the clearest thing she'd ever shown me, but because of what my husband didn't do. He sat there. He kept eating. I need to back up because the context matters. You need to understand what I had been carrying into that house for 4 years before you can understand why walking out that night felt less like a choice and more like gravity. I met my husband at a conference in Chicago. He was funny and warm, and he had this way of making you feel like the most interesting person in the room. We dated long distance for 8 months, then I relocated to be closer to him. I had 2 kids from my first marriage, my daughter, who was 3 at the time, and my son, who was barely 1. Their father and I had co-parented civilly, and I wasn't looking for anyone to replace him. I was just trying to build something stable. My husband, I'll call him by what his family called him, which was just the responsible one. Though that turned out to mean something different to each of us, he was the youngest of 4. His mother was a woman who wore her sacrifices like jewelry. She reminded you of them constantly, casually, the way you'd reference the weather. I gave up my career for this family. I moved across the country for your father. I held this family together when nobody else would. She wasn't wrong about any of it, probably, but she had decided that her sacrifice entitled her to a certain kind of return, and she was still collecting on it 20 years later. His father had been laid off twice in the past decade. They owned their home outright, paid off before my husband and I even met, but they had taken out a home equity line of credit to fund what I can only describe as a lifestyle that didn't match their income. They drove a new truck. They took a cruise every other year. His mother got her nails done weekly and bought her clothes from a catalog that I will just say was not the discount section. None of this would have been my problem, except that within 6 months of my husband and I getting serious, it became my problem. The first time was his parents' water heater. It broke in February and they needed $1,400 to replace it. My husband brought it up at dinner, framed it carefully, said they didn't want to ask, but they were a little short this month. I said yes because it was a water heater in February, and what kind of person says no to that? I wrote a check. Then it was the property taxes. Then it was his sister's car. She'd gotten behind on payments and needed someone to cover 2 months so she didn't lose it. Then it was the cruise. Yes, the cruise. Framed as an anniversary trip they'd been planning for 30 years and might never get another chance to take. I was a project manager at a mid-sized construction firm by then. I made good money. Not cruise for other adults' money, but enough that I didn't feel I could say no without seeming cruel. My husband contributed to the household expenses, but he was a high school teacher. He made $54,000 a year in a city where rent alone will eat you alive if you let it. I made nearly 3 times that. So gradually, over months and then years, I became the financial infrastructure of 2 households. I kept a spreadsheet. I am someone who keeps spreadsheets. Over 4 years, I calculated that I had transferred, loaned, covered, or otherwise redirected just over $87,000 toward my in-laws' household. Some of it was small, $200 here, $400 there. Some of it was not small. I never saw any of it come back. My mother-in-law called me resourceful. I thought for a long time that was a compliment. I understand now it was a job description. The thing about my kids is this: they were good kids. My daughter was quiet and observant, and she noticed everything. My son was chaotic and sweet, and he loved trucks and scrambled eggs and his stuffed elephant named Gerald. They were the center of my life. They came to every family dinner, every holiday, every birthday party, because my husband and I were a family, and we did things as a family. Or so I thought. I started noticing the seating thing about a year in. His sister Peyton had 2 kids, roughly the same ages as mine. At family dinners, Peyton's kids always sat at the main table. Mine always ended up at the folding table in the corner, or the breakfast bar, or, memorably, on a blanket on the floor during a 4th of July cookout because the picnic table only seats 8. I told myself it was logistics. I told myself it didn't mean anything. But my daughter noticed. She was 5 when she first asked me, "How come we always sit somewhere else?" I told her it was because she and her brother were so good at being flexible. I hated myself for saying it. I was lying to make her feel better about something I didn't yet have the courage to name. Peyton herself wasn't cruel exactly. She was indifferent in that particular way that cuts just as deep. She would talk to my husband at dinner and sort of look through me, like I was a window. She never learned my son's middle name despite being asked twice. Once, when my daughter lost a tooth at a family birthday party and everyone made a big fuss over Peyton's youngest, who'd also just lost a tooth, my daughter stood on the edge of the circle holding her tooth in her hand and nobody asked. I had to be the one to say, "Hey, show everyone what happened," and even then the moment had passed. My mother-in-law was more direct. She never used my kids' names if she could avoid it. She said Peyton's kids, and your too, as if those were the categories. She would buy gifts for the grandchildren at Christmas, and the piles would be measurably different. Not in price, necessarily, but in thought. Peyton's kids got things they'd mention wanting. Mine got things that were fine. Nice enough. Generic. I told my husband. The first time, he said I was reading into it. The second time, he said his mother didn't mean it that way. The third time, he got defensive and said I was making family dinners stressful. After that, I stopped telling him and started recording things in my phone instead. Not to build a case, just because I needed somewhere to put it. The night with the serving dish wasn't the first thing my mother-in-law had said out loud, but it was the first time she'd said it in front of my kids, at a volume they could hear, without lowering her voice even a fraction. And it was the first time my husband had watched it happen and stayed in his seat. We got fast food on the way home. My daughter ate her nuggets and didn't talk much. My son fell asleep in his car seat with a French fry still in his hand. When we got home, I put them both to bed and sat on the kitchen floor for a while, which is something I do when I don't know what else to do with my body. My husband came home about 2 hours later. He said his mother hadn't meant it the way it sounded. I asked him what way she had meant it. He didn't have an answer. He said she was old-fashioned. I said what she did was not old-fashioned. It was a choice, and she had made it in front of my children, and he had sat there and let it happen. He said I was overreacting. I said I wasn't overreacting. I was very, very calm, actually, and that was the part he should be worried about. We didn't resolve anything that night. We went to bed in the same silence people go to bed in when they've stopped trying to convince each other of things. But something had shifted in me. I've tried to explain this to people who ask, and the closest I can get is this. I had been treating my generosity like a tool for earning my place. If I was helpful enough, present enough, financially essential enough, maybe they would eventually accept my kids as theirs. Maybe my mother-in-law would learn their names the way she knew Peyton's kids' names. Maybe the piles under the Christmas tree would even out. I had been operating on this assumption for 4 years without ever saying it out loud, and sitting on that kitchen floor, I finally heard it clearly enough to understand that it was never going to work. You cannot pay your way into being valued by people who have already decided your value. I was done subsidizing people who thought my children were worth less than scraps. The next Monday, I made some changes. I did it quietly. I didn't announce it. I didn't send an email or make a phone call. I simply stopped. The automatic transfer I had set up to help cover my in-laws' mortgage supplement, I canceled it. The standing agreement where I covered Peyton's car insurance because she was between jobs, I sent her a text saying I was no longer able to continue that starting next month. The informal arrangement where my husband would Venmo his parents whenever they needed a cushion, with the understanding that I was the one funding the account. I told my husband I needed that money to go into our daughter's college savings instead. which was a conversation we had been delaying for 2 years. I also called my attorney. Not a divorce attorney. My general attorney, who I'd worked with on some property things a few years back. I wanted to understand exactly what was mine, what was joint, what was protected. I wanted to know where I stood before anyone else knew I was looking. The first month was quiet. My mother-in-law called twice about things I would have previously helped with. I was friendly. I said I was sorry. We were stretched right now. I hoped they could work it out. She said, of course, in a tone that said nothing of the kind. The second month, the HELOC payment came due, and they didn't have the cushion they were used to having. My husband mentioned it at dinner. I said that sounded really hard and went back to helping our son with his spelling words. The third month, Peyton's car got repossessed. I found this out through my husband, who found it out through his mother, who called him 6 times in one afternoon. He came home looking hollowed out. He said his family was in crisis. I said I understood that must be very hard to watch. He said, wasn't I going to help? I said I had been helping for 4 years, and it hadn't actually helped. It had just moved the crisis 6 weeks forward each time, and I wasn't willing to keep doing that to myself or to our kids' future. He sat with that for a while. He didn't argue. I think he knew I was right. I think he had known for longer than he'd admitted. His parents listed the house. They had equity in it. The HELOC had eaten some of it, but not all, and what remained was enough for them to downsize into something they could actually afford. It wasn't the disaster my mother-in-law had been performing toward for years. It was just a smaller house. But she spoke about it like it was a tragedy, and her children were expected to grieve accordingly. My husband went to help them pack one Saturday. I stayed home with my kids. We made pancakes and watched a movie, and my son performed what I can only describe as a dramatic recreation of the entire plot of a cartoon he'd seen 3 times, which took 45 minutes and was completely riveting. It was one of the best Saturdays I'd had in years. The shift with my husband came slowly. And I want to be honest about that, because the version of this story where he suddenly understood everything and became a different person overnight is not the version that actually happened. It was more like watching someone gradually come up for air. He started talking to me differently. Not big conversations, small ones. He started asking how I was doing in a way that waited for an actual answer. He started noticing things, like when my daughter seemed quiet at dinner, or when I'd been working late and hadn't eaten. He started picking the kids up from school on Tuesdays without my having to ask, because he realized I had a standing late call on Tuesdays and nobody had ever thought to cover that. About 2 months after his parents moved into the smaller place, he came home from visiting them and he sat down at the kitchen table and said, I think I've been asking you to carry something you should never have had to carry. I didn't say anything for a moment. I wanted to hear where he was going. He said he'd been watching his parents unpack and his mom had made a comment about everything we lost, and something in him had just, he said the word clicked into place. He said he realized his mother's version of the story would always have a villain, and the villain would always be the person who stopped enabling her. And he had spent years making sure that person wouldn't be him. He'd let it be me instead. He said he was sorry. Not in the way people say sorry when they want the conversation to end. In the way people say sorry when they've actually looked at something and can't look away from it anymore. I told him I needed time. He said that was fair. We started seeing a couples therapist, a woman named, well, I won't use her name, but she had an office near our neighborhood and a very direct style that I appreciated. She had a way of sitting quietly until my husband finished the comfortable version of things and then asking, very gently, and what's the part you're leaving out? He hated it at first. Then he started to need it. We worked through a lot over the following months. Things I'd stored in my phone notes, things he hadn't realized he'd been doing. The way he'd learned in his family of origin that women managed the emotional and financial labor, and men managed the perception of having handled it. He hadn't invented that. He'd inherited it. But he was choosing now what to do with it. My mother-in-law asked to see the kids about 4 months after everything had shifted. She sent the request through my husband, which I thought was interesting. She had always had my number. He told her she should reach out directly. She didn't for another few weeks. Then she sent me a text that said she hoped we could put the past behind us for the sake of the grandchildren. I read the text 3 times. I noticed that it said the grandchildren and not your kids or their names. I noticed there was no apology in it. I noticed it framed everything as something mutual, the past, as though what had happened was a weather event that had affected us all equally, rather than a series of choices she had made over 4 years that had told my children, in 100 small ways and one large one, that they were less. I showed it to my husband. He read it. He said, "She didn't apologize." I said, "No." He said, "I'll talk to her." Whatever that conversation was, I wasn't in it. But something must have happened because 2 weeks later she called me directly. It was a Sunday afternoon. She said she wanted to talk about the dinner. She said she knew what she'd said hadn't been right. She didn't say she was sorry. Not exactly. Not in words, but she said it in the way some people from certain generations do it, through acknowledgement rather than apology. And I decided to accept it because I was tired of spending energy on her and because my daughter deserved to know her grandmother, even a complicated version of her. We set up a visit. Neutral ground. A park, not their house. My mother-in-law brought lemonade in a cooler and a bag of chips, and she actually sat on the grass and played some kind of card game with my kids that I'd never seen her play with anyone before. My son beat her twice, and she acted outraged both times in a way that made him absolutely dissolve with laughter. I watched from a picnic blanket. I didn't join. I wasn't ready for that. But I watched my daughter show her grandmother a gymnastics move she'd been practicing, and my mother-in-law said, "Again, let me see it again." And my daughter did it again, beaming. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a full reset. There would be more conversations, more friction, more moments where I'd have to decide what to absorb and what to name out loud. But it was something. It was a start made by my children's grandmother because her son had finally stopped standing between the truth and the room. Peyton's car situation resolved itself eventually. She got a new job, an actual one, with benefits, and financed a used car on her own. I heard this through my husband in the way you hear news about people who have moved to the edge of your life. I was glad for her, genuinely. She had never been my enemy. She'd just been someone whose mother loved her differently than she loved anyone else, and she had never thought much about what that cost the people sitting at the other table. My in-laws' smaller house has a backyard. My mother-in-law planted tomatoes this summer, which she'd apparently always wanted to do, but the old house's yard was too shady. She sent me a photo of the first tomato. A full photograph texted directly to me. My son, who by then had developed opinions about gardening the way 7-year-olds develop opinions about everything, sent back a voice memo about the optimal conditions for tomato growth. She sent a laughing emoji. It was, I think, the most natural interaction we had ever had. My husband coaches my son's soccer team now on Saturday mornings. I did not ask him to do this. He signed up. He bought the cones. He watches YouTube tutorials about age-appropriate drills with a seriousness that I find both hilarious and deeply moving. My daughter comes to every game and sits in a camp chair and does her homework and sometimes looks up to cheer, and she has started calling my husband Dad. Not all the time, not formally, but in the way kids do when a word has just quietly become accurate. He cried the first time she said it. He didn't think I noticed. I noticed. I still keep the spreadsheet. Not to look at it. I don't need to look at it, but I haven't deleted it because I think it's important to know exactly what you were willing to carry and what it cost you and what you finally put down. The money is gone. I made peace with that. You can't unwrite checks, and I don't really want to spend the rest of my life being angry about resources I was fortunate enough to have had. What I care about is what replaced it. The last time we had a family dinner, my husband's whole family, his parents, Peyton and her kids, my mother-in-law set the table herself. She put my son on her right and my daughter across from her, and Peyton's kids filled in around them. And nobody made a separate table, and nobody said anything about who ate first. My daughter looked at me across the room before we all sat down. She gave me this tiny, private look, not a big moment, not cinematic, just the look of a kid who has been paying attention for years and finally has something different to report. I gave her a small nod back. We sat down. We ate dinner. That was enough. I used to think patience was the same thing as strength. I held that belief for 4 years while I wrote checks and swallowed comments and told my daughter she was flexible when what I meant was, I don't know how to protect you from this yet. I thought if I was generous enough, present enough, useful enough. Eventually, the people in that house would see my children the way I saw them, as whole, as worthy, as belonging. I was wrong. And the cost of being wrong about that particular thing is not something you can put in a spreadsheet, though I tried. What I understand now, looking back at all of it, is that actions have a way of compounding, not in any mystical sense, just in the plain mechanical way that choices made repeatedly build the conditions you eventually have to live inside. My mother-in-law made a choice over and over to treat my children as secondary. My husband made a choice over and over to look at the ceiling when it happened, and I made a choice over and over to fund a household that had decided my kids weren't worth a seat at the main table. All of those choices stacked up. All of them created the night with the serving dish. And when I finally stopped making my choice, when I canceled the transfers and said not anymore, all the other choices had nowhere left to hide. That's not revenge. I want to be clear about that because I've thought about it enough to be sure. Revenge would have required me to want them to suffer. I didn't. I just stopped participating in something that was costing my children their sense of their own value. And the financial consequences that followed were simply what happened when people who had built a lifestyle on someone else's generosity had to face their own math. They were never my responsibility to protect from that reckoning. I had just believed for too long that they were. The thing about integrity, the real kind, not the performed kind, is that it asks you to keep your actions consistent with what you actually believe, even when it's expensive, even when the people around you are counting on you not to. I believed my children deserved to be treated as family. I believed my resources belonged first to their future. It took me 4 years to make my behavior match those beliefs, and the gap between what I believed and how I acted is the thing I carry now, not as guilt exactly, but as information, as something I won't repeat. My daughter is 9 now. She does gymnastics and reads too fast and has opinions about everything, which I find exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. She knows her grandmother's name for the tomato plants. She beats her at card games without mercy. She doesn't know the full story of what happened, and she doesn't need to yet. What she knows is that when something was wrong, I didn't explain it away. I took her hand and I left. And then, quietly, I fixed it. I think that's the part that matters most. Not the spreadsheet, not the canceled transfers, not even the smaller house or Peyton's repossessed car. The part that matters is the moment my daughter looked at me across a room at a family dinner, a year after all of it, and had something different to report. That look was the return on everything I'd finally stopped being afraid to do. You don't earn your children's trust by telling them they're loved. You earn it by showing them in the moments that cost you something, that you mean it,